Welcome everyone to the November Tobacco Research Seminar Series. Today, we're thrilled to introduce Dr. Maciej Goniewicz. He is a professor of oncology in the Department of Health Behavior at Roseville Park Comprehensive Cancer Center. Dr. Goniewicz is a well-known expert in the tobacco research field, and his research spans from smoking cessation treatment, pharmacotherapy, pharmacokinetics, and it's conducted both in clinical and community settings. Currently, Dr. Goniewicz investigates emerging nicotine-containing products with particular emphasis on new vaping devices and alternative forms of tobacco. He does that through laboratory evaluations, toxicological assessments, and user surveys. His work explores potential application in harm reduction and smoking cessation, as well as the impact of the ever-evolving tobacco control laws. Dr. Goniewicz has a remarkable track record of impactful research projects, and just to name a few, he serves as a co-principal investigator on NIH-funded T-Course program, which develops novel framework for assessing the health and behavior effects of flavored tobacco products. He also serves as a co-PI on a project, joint project by NIH and NIDA, assessing the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of cannabinoids with or without concurrent nicotine use. And this is just a few. He also contributes as a co-investigator on the NIH-funded National Longitudinal Survey of Tobacco Use, which aims to evaluate FDA regulations through extensive data on tobacco use patterns and health outcomes across diverse populations. With over 200 publications, Dr. Goniewicz's contributions to the field are both prolific and impactful, and we are very thrilled to have him today as a speaker for our seminar. We would like you to feel free to submit your questions in the chat or hold them till the end, when we will have a questions Q&A sessions following the presentation. And with that, Dr. Goniewicz, you take it away.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be with you today virtually, and I on this list of my achievement, I think I should mention that I collaborate with many of the folks online on your side, and I see many familiar names. So it's great to be among the friends and collaborators. So thank you so much for inviting me. I was asked to talk about the poly-use of the different tobacco products, and I chose this topic to focus on the dual use of the electronic cigarettes and tobacco cigarettes, as this is the predominant form of the poly-use of the different tobacco products. So I would try to dig deeper into the different aspects of the dual use of electronic cigarettes with combustible cigarettes. Of course, my usual statement in terms of the conflict of interest, just want to emphasize no connection, no work for any vaping or tobacco companies, some work for pharmaceutical companies that manufacture nicotine replacement therapies, but kind of not related to the topic of today, of my talk today. And since the most of the research that I will present today are funded by the federal funder agencies from US, so I need to emphasize that none of what I say is their official statement. So I will go with the three main topics and three different kind of aspects to understanding the phenomena of the dual use. So the first, how we define the dual use and how we measure it using different tools and different settings. As particularly, I want to focus on the consideration of the frequency and intensity of smoking and vaping. So that will be first part of my talk. Then I would like to go deeper into the potential health risk and health consequences of the dual use, especially when it compared to the continuous smoking of the combustible cigarettes. And finally, I want to finish with what we know about the transition from into and from the dual use to the exclusive vaping, and whether we can design the intervention to accelerate this process. So let's start with the part one. So let's talk about what we really mean by the dual use and what is the heterogeneity of that term. So, from the very beginning, when I started my research on electronic cigarettes, the primary focus of the potential consequences of vaping or introduction of this product were focused on the transition. So we focus on the situation when we have substitute of the one product for another product. And it was true for smokers. It was true when we were discussing or we were doing research on a potential quitting or the cessation of smoking or harm reduction with electronic cigarettes. So there was this idea that what would happen that if the smokers stop using combustible cigarettes but transition completely to vaping, ever gradually, but kind of there was always on a table the discussion about a complete substitution and changing the one product for another product. On the other hand, when it comes to the young people and implications for the new products for younger generation, was this danger that the uptake of the vaping product may lead them in the future to substituting with the at that time more effective nicotine delivery products that were combustible cigarettes. So kind of this aspect of the substitution was that dominated the discussion at that time, and we didn't really acknowledge, at least from my perspective, I didn't acknowledge, the situation that there will be a lot of users who will be like kind of in the cycle here. So once using electronic cigarettes, once using combustible cigarettes, and maybe coming back between those two products. And, if you think about it, there are many consumer products that are either designed or promoted by industry, either as a substitute products or as a complementary products. When we are probably using iPhones, and many of us are in the iPhone clients, the Apple clients. When I buy the iPad, I'm not throwing my iPhone because now I have a new device. I'm becoming dual user, and now I'm poly user because I have my iWatch and etc. So these, there is a consumer model that the company is promoting a new products as a complementary. So you when you cannot smoke, you can use another product. When you cannot vape, you can use oral products. So we see this messaging from the company, and that's reality that we need to measure and we need to understand. And when the early studies show up, on the patterns of this poly use, that was actually predominant pattern. We see the most of the electronic cigarette users, especially the older ex-smokers or smokers, still reported using the combustible cigarettes use. So there was reason for reducing combustible cigarette consumption, but not necessarily quitting, or use the new product when the smokers cannot or are not allowed to smoke. So those reasons were they were coming out in whether focus groups or some of the large surveys. So like understanding that was reality, that there was a predominant pattern among the smokers who initiated use of electronic cigarettes. And there's the PAP study, when the first wave actually came out, the data from the first wave, the dual use of cigarettes and e-cigarettes was a predominant pattern of poly use. And I think the study opened our eyes that we need to understand this real implication of those potential new products, because some people are using a single product or vaping or they do smoking, but majority of the tobacco users are actually using at least 2 or more products. And the more products we're getting on the market, we're getting a more possibility of the combinations between them. We need to understand the context of them. We need to understand the effects on the addiction. We need to understand the health effects. Now, with the use of the 2 products leads to the more exposure to nicotine and a higher potential addiction to the nicotine. What about the health effects? Whether using 2 products will have additive effects on the health. So these questions are still on the table. I would talk a little bit today about some of those research that we did to understand those patterns of poly use and the consequences of poly use. But the multiple product use is common, is prevalent, and that's what people are doing. That's what users of nicotine are doing today, and that's why the topic is so important. It's not only among the adults. We see the pattern of polyuse of the different tobacco products in the younger people. This is one of the study that I done in Poland when we look at the dual use of electronic cigarettes and tobacco cigarettes, and again the pattern of the polyuse, the dual use of the two products was common at that time, and we actually see some new data that are showing the dual use of vaping products and pouches in the U.S. population. So this is evolving as a landscape of the products evolve in the different countries across the different regulatory frameworks. We still see the pattern use of the multiple products in the different countries. We see the pattern of the dual use of HTP and tobacco cigarettes in Japan. It's happening there too. So it's really to understand the context of the different products and the concurrent use of those products. The major challenge when talking about the dual use and understanding the dual use is how we define the dual use, and it's been the challenge even in a PAP study when we look at the wave 1 data. In many studies, including our own, that when we want to qualify the people to the different persons to the different groups, users to the different groups, we use this question about whether you use the product in the past 30 days. So if somebody answers, yes, I did smoke, I used combustible cigarettes in the past 30 days, and also answer on the question, yes, I did the vape product and I did it in the past 30 days, then we say, okay, there's 2 yes answers, then we will put this person in a category of the dual use. But you may already think about what's going on, like how challenging it is. So let's say we study health consequences of dual use, and we have a person who is a regular smoker, smoke pack a day of cigarettes, and once a while try electronic cigarette and tried electronic cigarettes in the past 30 days. That person, based on this categorization, will be qualified as the dual user. On the other hand, we may have a vapor who is vaping every day, who is vaping regularly, and 2 weeks ago at the party had a 1 tobacco cigarette. That person also will be classified as a dual user based on the past 30 days criteria. So we are approaching this problem of the heterogeneity of the dual use group based on the intensity and the frequency of use of both of the products. So this is the example of the study that we have done based on the ITC, International Tobacco Control project, when we look at the dual users from 3 countries, that was Canada, US, and the UK, and we try to stratify them based on the frequency of the product use. So we developed this kind of, if you look at the green area, this is kind of 2x2 table when we have people who are reporting daily use of the 1 or 2 products and people who reported occasional use of the non-daily use of the product. You have on the top, this is the frequency of the smoking, and you have the frequency of the vaping in the first column. So if you look at this green area, so we might have the people who are what we call the predominant smokers. So they really smoke regularly and occasionally non-daily use the vaping product. We did propose the term predominant smoker. On the other kind of opposite of the spectrum of the dual use pattern, we have people that we call the predominant vapers. Those were people who daily vape, who vape frequently, and occasionally non-daily use the tobacco products. And then we had a proportion of the respondents who reported daily use of both products. This is what we refer to dual daily users. And finally, we have non-daily use of both products, and that's what we call the concurrent non-daily user. And that's what was distribution. So overall, at that time, we have about 10% in our sample size, 11% of the dual users. And what you can see, most of them, over half of the of respondents in the dual use groups were actually predominant smokers. Again, those are regular daily smokers and once a while the vaping. That was the majority of the dual user were in this category. The predominant vapors, so persons who vape daily, that was actually the smallest group. The persons who vape on a daily basis and once a while had a vaping episode. This is minority in at least in the study. This was the minority. The dual daily use, so the use of the products, move products regularly, it was about 1/3 of our sample, and the other group was this concurrent non-daily use. So as you can see, was a majority of the dual users are still smoking on a daily basis, and once a while we're using the vaping products. It has implication for example, assessment of the exposure to the toxicants. If the majority of our dual users are smoking daily, we might expect levels of toxicant exposure similar to the smokers. On the other hand, if our dual group will be skewed towards predominant vapors, then we might expect a low exposure to tobacco-specific toxicants in that group. So having more understanding about the characteristics of our dual user group is really important for any future studies that assess the patterns of use, transitions, or health consequences of the dual use. So please keep it in mind. I will come back to this this heterogeneity when I will be talking about exposure to toxicants in the dual user group. But right now, what I would like you to remember is that many of the studies that focus on the dual group actually included the predominant smokers in the population. And it's not only pattern of use. This is the study that the continuation of the ITC project, when we use kind of the identity and how people feel about the attitudes and the measures of the addiction to the different products, and we notice that there are some differences how people describe themselves, to which category they see they kind of belong. So this identity of whether they perceive themselves as a smokers or they perceive themselves as a vapor is also different. So for example, in a non-daily dual user, so people that use those two products on an occasionally, they are very different from the daily users in many measures. They have more positive attitudes to smoking. The predominant smokers have more positive attitudes to smoking than occasional smokers. In the predominant smokers, so those the majority of our sample, they swap the analysis towards a kind of smoking behavior because their identity was very close related to the smoking behavior, and they reported many of the characteristics of the exclusive smokers. So the predominant smokers look more like the exclusive smokers, when the non-daily users and the predominant vapors looks more like a vapor. So it again has an implication when you study the attitudes towards different products, when you study the potential addiction behavior, the addiction consequences of using two products. So those heterogeneous groups may respond to your questions in a very different way. So that was kind of conclusion from the part one that I would like us to remember, that whenever you think about studying the dual use, keep in mind that how heterogeneous this group is, and try to implement those knowledge into your design of the study or your tools, whether it's survey or it's some assessment of the health effects of the dual use. This is what I mentioned. It's not only what we see in the US with electronic cigarettes and combustible cigarettes. We see a very similar pattern in our ITC project when we look at Japan as well. The newest data coming from Korea. This is the market. Those are the two markets where the use of the HTP, like IQOS products, is very predominant. And in those countries, also we see a lot of dual use of the HTP and combustible cigarettes. And we see a dual daily use or predominant smokers, so still daily smoking being the majority of the dual users in those countries. The data that you see is from our paper analyzing the dual use in Japan, but still majority of the dual users continue to smoke on a daily basis. So let's talk about the potential exposure and the consequences of the dual use when it comes to exposure to toxicants and nicotine and the potential health consequences. So the first, I would like to talk about the patterns of exposure to toxicants among the dual users. This is again the PAF study, the biospecimen core, so the subsample of the PAF study participants that provided the biological samples for measurement of the different biomarkers of exposure and potential harm. So in the wave one, we identified about almost 800 dual users. Again, we did it based on the past 30 days reporting status. So the samples were analyzed for the different biospecimens, including the including the biomarkers of nicotine exposure and the biomarkers that indicated the exposure to tobacco products or tobacco smoke, so more tobacco-specific biomarkers, as well as the biomarkers of exposure to volatile organic compounds, which some of them have been reported in electronic cigarettes and, of course, in combustible cigarettes as well. So if we look at the distribution again in a PAF study, what was the predominant pattern of use? It's the same like in the ITC project. Most of the participants in PAF study were predominant smokers. So the dual users in a PAF study, again, most of them were smoking daily and using vaping product once a while. The second group, as you can see, was daily dual users. So there was the participants who about 13% of our sample reported using two products on a daily basis, and then the other two groups. But if you think already about the exposure to the toxicants, when 70% of your samples reporting using combustible cigarettes on a daily basis, you already might think, okay, so the data will be skewed, will be more resemble what we see among the regular combustible cigarette users. So that was kind of indication that the distribution of the biomarkers in the dual user group will be similar to what we see among the regular smokers. So the way we approach this comparison, we actually started with the biomarkers. So we took the distribution of the biomarker data in a PAF study, and we stratified the exposure to the low. This is the lowest quartile, moderate, that was the second and third quartile, and the highest, the higher quartile, the fourth quartile was the high exposure. So we asked the question, so who is able among the dual users, who is able to keep the exposure on the low levels and who is not able to reduce, or who is in a group that of the high exposure? So are there any predictors in the PAF study that will indicate will determine whether you fall into the low exposure category or the high exposure category if you are the dual users? And when we look at the participants who had a high exposure, whether it was exposure to nicotine, whether it was exposure to tobacco-specific nitrosamines or some metals and volatile organic compounds. So this is the high quartile, the upper bar. As you see, that group is dominated by those dual users who daily smoke. It's not a rocket science. It's just what's driving the exposure in the group. But again, we have most of them, most dual users in this category. So A lot of people who are daily smoker will be in a high exposure category. On the opposite, those who achieve the low exposure, those who had the low exposure in a PAF study, those are people who predominantly vaping. Those were people who were vaping and were non-daily users of both products. So in other words, the less frequent smokers, we see the lower biomarker exposure. The more frequent smokers, a higher biomarker of exposures. Are there any other predictors of being the dual users with low toxicant exposure? Again, smoking is driving everything, but also we see the predictor in terms of the younger age. Those were so most of the younger people were in a category of the low exposure. It might be explained that a different pattern of use. There's some more vaping in that group. We also see some ethnicity differences. So actually, the Hispanic, the people who identify as a Hispanic, were more likely to be in a group of the low exposure. And when it comes to the dual use with high exposure, actually the predictors here, well, the older age, again, more smoking, and female. Actually, the female group, those who identify as female, had a higher odds of being in a group of the high exposure. So once we know that the frequency of the product is driving a lot of exposure to toxicants, we stratify in a PAF study the dual users on the frequency, daily versus non-daily frequency, and we compare to the exclusive users who had a same pattern of product use. So the blue bar that is in the middle of each of the graph, those are levels of toxicant biomarkers of exposure in the dual users. On the right side, on the red color, this is the pattern of the exposure in exclusive cigarette users in the same study. And the green one is exclusive electronic cigarette users. So, sorry, if you look at the similarity of and the differences, if we have a daily smoker, so the dual users who is daily smoking, if you look across all of the graphs, the exposure to toxicant is almost identical, like in the daily cigarette users. With the non-daily, we have a much variations here, but the frequency of the smoking appears to drive the differences in the exposure to the toxicants. Interestingly, when we did the same and we look at the frequency of vaping, the vaping frequency actually did not have much effect on the exposure to toxicants. So it appears that in a dual users was primarily driving the exposure to toxicants is the frequency of smoking and not necessarily frequency of vaping. That's why when we have a lot of daily smokers in the dual use groups, we will see a higher levels of exposure to toxicants in that group. So again, this is the summary. When you have the spectrum of the levels of the biomarkers in a dual user group, from high to on the right, you see the left, those who are older female and what most important, more frequent and intense smokers tend to have higher levels of biomarkers. Those who are younger and smoke less and also vape more, they will have the low levels of the biomarkers of exposure. So we know that daily versus non-daily matters, but what about that small group that reported daily use of tobacco cigarettes? Is there any association with the exposure to toxicants in that group based on the number of episodes they use the product or number of cigarettes they smoke? So this is analysis of the respondents that reported daily use of two products, so daily vaping and daily smoking. It's a smaller group, only 91 participants, but we are able to do some of the analysis. So we look at in this study based on the number of cigarettes they smoke a day. We also look at the kind of measure of the puffing episodes on the electronic cigarettes, which I will not present here. It's very messy measure, and we abandoned actually this approach in the early studies because the people are just guessing how much they vape. So it was hard to measure. But when we look at the cigarettes per day in our group, so we were able to stratify this group of the 91 daily dual users based on the number of cigarettes they smoke a day. This is the description of the sample, and as you can see, there is about 20 to 30 participants in each of the groups. So when we look at the exposure in the daily dual users, we see some trend with the increasing number of cigarettes per day, and that group that reported 1 to 5 on some of the biomarkers, they have a lower levels. This is exposure to nicotine. Actually, there was no statistically significant difference. We consistently see that exposure to nicotine in the dual users is kind of similar. In the daily dual users, it's similar. When we look at some of the tobacco-specific biomarkers, they were actually lower in those who smoke only few cigarettes, so 5 and less cigarettes a day, than those groups. That group had a lower levels of biomarkers specific to tobacco smoke. We did not see much difference in those who smoke 6 to 10 and 11 and more. There was no reduction. There was no difference in exposure. And this pattern actually was seen for the other toxicants and the other biomarkers of exposure to toxicants. So when you look at the biomarkers of exposure to tobacco-specific nitrosamine, this is the NNK biomarker and NAL. Again, reduction, the lower levels in those who smoke 1 to 5, but no statistical difference between those who smoke 6 to 10 and more than 11. And the same pattern for some of the VOCs, and it was similar pattern. So always the group that smoked only few cigarettes, less than 5 and less, were the group that had a reduction in the exposure. So when it comes to kind of summary of the nicotine and toxicant exposure in the dual users, when you look at the population-based data from including all of the dual users, especially when you use this criteria of the past 30 days use of the two products, we do not see a significant difference in the exposure to toxicants in the dual users as compared to exclusive smokers. So that group actually looks much like the smokers. However, the biomarker illustrate a high variability in the toxicant exposure among the dual users. The nicotine exposure is not so much difference, even if you look at the different groups of the dual users. So they have a similar exposure to nicotine. And what's driving the exposure to toxicants is the frequent cigarette smoking, and it's always the significant factor and a predictor of the exposure to toxicants. The dual users who smoke non-daily have biomarker concentration very similar to the intermittent smokers, so non-regular smokers. However, the dual users who continue to smoke daily, their concentration of the biomarkers are generally equivalent to what we see in the daily smokers. The electronic cigarette use intensity have virtually no influence on toxicant exposure in dual users. I want to emphasize we're still talking about the dual users. You know, there might be effect, and we see some effect in the exclusive vapors. However, because the exposure in the dual users is primarily driven by smoking, the effect of the frequency of the e-cigarette use appears to be minimal here. And the observed significant concentration, greater concentration of tobacco-specific biomarkers is related to cigarettes per day. So not only daily versus non-daily, but also in cigarettes per day. And the data that we see in the dual users who smoke 5, even if they smoke daily, but they smoke 5 or fewer cigarettes per day, then we observe the lower concentration of the biomarkers. So Now we are moving to the most challenging question. So the biomarkers in the dual users, they really can be used to predict a risk in the dual user, the health risk, whether it's the risk of the cardiovascular diseases, some respiratory diseases, lung cancer, etc. So does it mean anything when we try to talk about the health risk? Of course, there's a lot of study that try to estimate the dose response in ever the levels of particulates or levels of the tobacco specific nitrosamines or biomarkers of those chemicals in the tobacco smoke or in the biospecimens collected from users. And the same has been done for other outcomes, including the cardiovascular outcomes. So I think overall that when it comes to the cancer risk, and particularly lung cancer risk, that dose response is much more linear, and it's much more established and studied. That's why for many years the pack years has been used, so the duration of the product use and the intensity of the product use as a predictors of the risk of the lung cancer. With the cardiovascular situation, it looks like the effect plateaus after some time of the intensity of the exposure, and there is some reduction in the risk with the lower intensity of tobacco smoke exposure, but later this effect, this relationship kind of plateau, and we don't see much reduction in the risk, for example, for smoking 20 versus 10 cigarettes per day. As I mentioned about the cigarettes per day and the frequency and so the dose response relationship between dose measure, there are studies looking at the cancer, the lung cancer risk, I think is well studied, and there's a lot of evidence, including evidence from your group, from Shanghai cohorts. So that's I think there's a strong evidence that those biomarkers, particularly the tobacco-specific nitrosamines, might be very good indicator of the risk of the lung cancer. And there's some effects on some studies on the diabetes when the biomarkers of exposure in smokers predicted the risk of the diabetes. The cardiovascular disease, there is some dose response, and this has been described as this kind of plateau line. So the difference in the low frequency of smoking, but little difference in a high frequency of smoking. So this is the model that we use in some of our studies, trying to understand what's going on with the dual users and how it might translate to the health risk. At the beginning, this is the model that we apply to the smokers that initiated use of the vaping products and may or may not quit smoking or decrease smoking. So you have this baseline. So these are our participants in the study, only the participants in a cohort, let's say PAP study. So they are using daily the combustible cigarettes or frequently combustible cigarettes. They don't have the contact with the vaping product yet. So then they move into this early phase of adaptation. They start using the electronic cigarettes. Of course, many will not try it, so they are not in our study. But the people that we're talking about, the people who initiated ENDS use. There's some interest, some experimentation with the ENDS use, some motivation to the ENDS use. So this is the step one when we see the early adaptation. So step two is very often when we evaluate what's going on with the adaptation of the new product. So we might see some kind of negative aspects of this adaptation. So if smoking is not changing, and in the worst case scenario, if the smoking is increasing, and the adding ENDS doesn't have the effects on the smoking, we might expect that the risk will be at least the same, like with the continuous smoking, if not greater because of adding the new products. But we should not anticipate any potential harm reduction in the group if smoking is not changing. And on the other hand, when we adding the ENDS and the people start quitting or significantly reducing, whether frequency of smoking or cigarettes per day, that is the group that we see potential benefit of the dual use, especially if it leads to the complete substitution later. But then we are looking at the the long-term effects, and this is getting more and more complicated. So let's say this is the follow-up and the next wave of the PUP study. Then we have another different potential scenarios here, because now the people might discontinue ENS use or might continue ENS use. So on the one extreme, we have a lot of smoking, nothing has changed, the people added, so we have a complementary product, and this is kind of worst case scenario. On the other hand, we have best outcome. This is the very green field, when people stop smoking and they also stop vaping. And in between, we have all of this continuum of the behavior that may translate to the different health outcomes. So, for example, people might try dual use. They, for the 1 year, experiment with the ENS, and in the middle, this is this gray field. That 1 year later, nothing has changed. They came back to smoking. They smoked the same as they did, and they stopped using ENS products. So that there was no transition in that group. So the more and more complexity we add, the more and more different patterns and of the product use, that it becomes more complicated. But I think there is a kind of continuum of this behavior that might be useful for us to describe based on the frequency of product use, based of adding or subtracting the product. So this can be somehow described and categorized. So before I finish, I want to talk about the last part, is this kind of, so what can we do? Is there anything that we know about how the dual users can transition from the dual use stage to the exclusive vaping? So we know that exclusive vaping significantly reduce exposure to the toxicants. That the new studies that are coming actually show more and more data on a potential harm reduction or health risk reduction in the smokers who transition to the exclusive vaping. So if we have this large population of the dual users, what can be done to move them to the stage of the exclusive vaping? So if you think about this model that we propose in one of our paper, is you have the tobacco cigarette on the right side, and you have the exclusive vaping on the right side. Sorry, tobacco smoking on the left side, and the exclusive vaping in the right side. So in the middle, there is this transition pattern. There is a pattern of the dual use. So what may push people, the dual users, into the right side? So we know there are some features of the product. The nicotine delivery appears to be really important factor, that the satisfaction from the product that delivers nicotine, vaping product that delivers nicotine in a similar way to tobacco cigarettes is really important. We know that those who reported the rapid relief in the urge to smoke from vaping products are also more likely to transition to the vaping. Some features of the product, like taste, the throat key, some of the sensory aspects of the product, are also important and may increase the chance in the transition to the vaping. On the other hand, there are some barriers. So if the person, the dual user, fear embarrassment from using the product, if you're uncomfortable using the product, if the product has a bad taste, if the perception of the harm of vaping product is high, if the people see the product as dangerous, as risky as tobacco cigarettes, those are barriers. So those people are less likely to transition into the exclusive vaping. So we might increase the appeal of the product, and we might propose the product or advise the product that is more effective in nicotine delivery. We can also target the barriers to the transition, for example, the perception of the harm. So this is interesting that the frequency of the use, there's actually a newer study. This is one of the early study analysis of the PUP study, but the frequency of vaping among the dual users is a very strong predictor of the discontinued smoking. So in other words, dual users who vape daily or who increase the frequency of vaping over the time are more likely to discontinue smoking and are more likely to transition into the exclusive vaping product. So one way to potentially have the behavioral change design for the dual users is target the frequency of the product use. So decrease the frequency of smoking while increasing the frequency of vaping. This may potentially increase the chances of the transitions towards exclusive vaping. The other way is to address one of the barriers in the transition, and what appears to from the PUB study and some other studies, including the ITC project, is this harm perception about the vaping products. So a lot of dual users actually, even though reach out for the vaping products in order to reduce or with the intention to reduce health risks, many of those perceive electronic cigarette as risky as tobacco cigarettes or close to the risk of tobacco cigarettes. So the perception of the risk is actually the higher perception, the lower likelihood, the lower odds of transitioning into the exclusive vaping. That means quitting smoking. And there were some trials, actually clinical trials already published and available, that tried to design the intervention for the dual users to quit smoking. That this is one of the studies that had an intervention to decrease the smoking in the dual users and target the smoking. So there was behavioral program that was designed for that purpose, and it was effective. So the conclusions from the last part. So we need to remember that transitioning from dual use to exclusive vaping means quitting smoking. We don't use the term quitting smoking for kind of legal reasons, and when we design the trials, it's mostly about a reduction in exposure or reduction in the smoking frequency. But it is quitting. It is discontinuation of the smoking. So what we can tell the dual users to get out from the cycle of the concurrent use of the product and potentially move to the less risky product. Educating the dual users about the health and benefits. The communication that the dual use is not a long-term effective strategy, especially if you keep smoking frequently, especially if you keep smoking a lot of cigarettes per day, a significant number of cigarettes per day. So this perception that I reduce a little bit of smoking, it just doesn't translate in a population-wide studies on the effects of the exposure and health effects in the dual users. And that's all from me. So I raised the question whether the dual use can be the effective public health kind of strategy to reduce the burden of smoking, or under circumstances that it either leads to complete transition towards the vaping or very significant reduction in the smoking intensity or cigarettes per day. Under those scenarios, yes. But if this is continuation of smoking and adding the new product and concurrent use of regularly two products, then it will not translate to the benefits to the individual and the population as a whole. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was a wonderful talk on such a complex topic. Let's see if we have any questions from the audience. If you have questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and pose the question, or please drop your question in chat.
I can start the question. Thank you so much for that presentation. I was personally very much glued to my screen, and I really appreciated the discussion of defining and then vital markers and transitioning. So thank you for that. So I guess I have a couple questions, but I'll just start with one. I understand that there are so many different e-cigarettes now, different type of product categories. And so have you guys noticed any, I know the path kind of lags behind, but we're starting to catch up. So have you noticed any heterogeneity in what you're seeing in the biomarkers by like the type of e-cigarette or the type of product?
Well, we see some emerging data from, so if you remember in the adults, we see some gap in the exposure to nicotine between exclusive vapors and exclusive smokers. And the dual users are actually very similar in the nicotine biomarker to exclusive smokers. But what I can say, the gap is closing in the young people. So in the younger cohort, in the younger groups, we see no difference in the exposure to nicotine in the exclusive vapors, exclusive smokers, and dual users. So I think those young people who started using vaping, they never smoked. It appears that right now the exposure to nicotine matches, and it was not like that in the early ages. In the early stage of the research, I think one of the contributors is exactly change in the product effectiveness of delivering nicotine. Of course, other factors like affordability of the product, the salts, but I think the shift to the salt-based, cheap, effective products in terms of nicotine delivery close that gap in the nicotine exposure. I think in some of the adults, we still see a difference, so it's still lower, even if they're using the new products. There are some upcoming analysis from the PAF study looking at the changes in the nicotine exposure over the time. I think the effect that I am confident to comment right now is the effect on the younger people, because that I know this gap, there is no significant difference in the smoking, young people who smoke and young people who vape, and it has changed over the time.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Hey, Dorothy.
Hi, Maciej. You had mentioned that you're making cigarettes, e-cigarettes more appealing, might transition people from smoking to exclusively using vaping products. So I guess I'm kind of curious to know what your thoughts are on flavored vaping products.
Yeah, so I haven't seen yet a randomized controlled trial that would compare flavor to non-flavor electronic cigarettes. And I think that would answer the question. I think there's some ongoing studies looking at the question. On the one hand, of course, the survey data, and including the PAV, and it appears that the flavors are very, very important to the adult users, and they reported they're using it they're still the most popular flavors, despite the restriction and the authorization of the tobacco flavor products. How important they are, I think that's the unknown question. Is it really if we don't have a flavor, would it be really barrier for the smokers to transition to the tobacco flavored electronic cigarette? I'm not convinced about, at least based on our data that we have from the flavor studies that we've done when we had a T course. One of the studies that we have done is not published yet. We're still analyzing the data. Was we kind of wanted to challenge the fruit flavor e-cigarette users with a situation when they will not have access to the product that is fruit flavored. And what we try to do is tell them, okay, you can have a vaping product with a good nicotine delivery, but with tobacco flavor. And the other group was offered pouches with the fruity flavors. And guess what? The transition to the fruit flavor e-cigarettes was way, way higher the transition rates in the group. So uptake of the tobacco flavor e-cigarettes was much higher than fruit flavor pouches. So to me, it appears that the vaping and pulmonary delivery of the nicotine was for our participant much more important than sticking to the flavor product.
Mhm.
Again, the tobacco flavor concept is really interesting because those products don't taste like tobacco. So it's really hard to judge on that. I don't know. I think that having randomized controlled trial that will give the smoker dual users the product with the fruit flavor versus the product with tobacco flavor and see whether the transitions are different would answer the question. I don't have those data.
Yeah, I think one of the studies conducted by Steve Higgins, where he actually had randomized people to very low nicotine content cigarettes with vapes with preferred flavors, meaning fruit flavors as well as tobacco flavors. And then he also had a condition where he randomized them to just very low nicotine with tobacco flavor.
Yep.
And it seemed like the people that had access to the flavor products actually did better than the people that had only access to tobacco products, which signifies that if you are trying to switch somebody to a more reinforcing product, it's not just nicotine, but it really is the flavor of the product. So anyway, that was one where it wasn't like he didn't have a condition where he had the normal nicotine content cigarettes and seeing what impact flavors have, but when you're looking at the very low nicotine, it was really was fascinating to find out that flavors really did have an impact. So anyway, well, I guess we'll just have to see it. Someone does a trial.
I think there's one like kind of cessation trial that at least that I am aware of. All of the trials that I was involved, we used tobacco flavor e-cigarettes, and after the experimentation trial, a lot of people switched to fruit flavor e-cigarettes. When we start providing them with the tobacco flavor product for free, and then they migrated to the fruit flavor. So we'll see. Maybe we'll have some authorized product.
Yeah, I guess we'll have the authorized menthol product now, right, for vape.
Yes, we don't know for how long. So that's Enjoy that has been authorized with the with the menthol. I don't know if you're familiar with the patent dispute.
Oh,
so
no.
There's a patent dispute between Juul and Enjoy. So it's kind of like what happened with IQOS. If it goes to the court, they might be blocked from selling Enjoy on the U.S. market. Unless they make it within the U.S., they manufacture it within the U.S. So it's complicated. So right now, there is an Enjoy and it's available. We know we can buy it and users can buy it. So there is a menthol Enjoy available. If the judge blocks the sale of the Enjoy because of this patent dispute, then the product could not be sold in the U.S. But I know that there are at least, I think, 2 applications for the fruit flavored products that has this feature of security, like a Bluetooth activation and deactivation. The companies announce it. So there are at least 2 companies that trying to get the product authorized with the fruit flavor. But I don't know what would be the decision of FDA, but I know that 2 companies submitted. So this is like e-cigarette that has like a safety feature that is hard for kids to activate it.
Was it biometric? Were they using biometric?
It's a Bluetooth connection.
Oh, okay, right. Yeah, I see. Well,
So they are under consideration by FDA.
Okay. Thank you. By the discussion, we see that this is a topic of great interest, and we are just about at the hour, and I don't see any questions in chat. So with that, I would really want to thank you for this wonderful talk and send greetings from Minneapolis.
Thank you. Greetings from Buffalo.
Thank,
Thank
thank you,
you for
everyone.
joining us. Thank you.
Take care. Thank you so much.